Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Open Cluster Management Community meeting. Today is September 12th, 2025. And on the agenda today, I think Q Jang is going to talk a little bit about the cluster proxy refactoring. Q Jang, do you want, please feel free to take it away whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Let me check which one. Just give me 1 second. This one. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Yeah, this one is something that I'm working with Xuezhao right now, but Xuezhao is on PTO. So I want to discuss about this. And I will share it in the Slack channel later because I think that might impact some existing component, but um, let's see the motivation. So as we know that we have a cluster proxy add-on, and this add-on is to provide a reverse proxy based on gRPC. So the user is able to connect to a certain managed cluster from an endpoint in the Hub API server instead of directly calling the API server of the managed cluster. So it's basically provide a connectivity capabilities to the managed cluster through a reverse gRPC tunnel. So it has been used quite a lot. So we already use it to fetch pod logs. And you can run the service that get logs of any pod in any managed cluster through the cluster proxy. And there is also use cases like using if someone install the KubeVirt on the managed cluster and start a VM in the managed cluster. And if user want to access a VM console through VNC, the user can also use the cluster proxy by accessing sub resources on their VM. And also we have some other integrations with other projects. For example, the multi-queue is using multi-queue is when multi-queue using to submit a job to multi-cluster, we have to provide a kube config so multi-queue can know which cluster it can access. So it can also be done with class proxy. So we have a controller running in the multi-queue that provide this kube config. Today it's still the API server external address of API server of the managed cluster. But with cluster proxy, we can remove that requirement that the hub cluster must be able to access the managed cluster API server. We can use the cluster proxy for the multi-queue case. And also, I think there's another project called Multi-Cluster Gateway that is in the kubevela project that also using cluster proxy to push requests to the target cluster. There is another potential use case is the cluster profile in a Sigma multi-cluster is building a plugin approach that the consumer can get a kube client or kube REST config to access any managed cluster that will be provided by a certain cluster manager. So in OCM context, we probably could also use cluster proxy to provide those REST config to the consumers. Um, but there is some gaps that we have found. One is the cluster proxy currently is implemented based on AMP. So we have an AMP binary embedded in the cluster proxy and use AMP to start the gRPC tunnel. And then cluster proxy is basically what we did is to have some way to configure the AMP server. And the problem is that AMP does just provide a connectivity interface. So it's a gRPC based interface. So the COOPs, we cannot directly use kubectl or uh, we cannot directly use kubectl to connect this interface. And we cannot just run build kube, like just have the REST config to connect to the cluster proxy. The client must be customized with some kind of dial options, uh, and to configure the connectivity in the dial options to let it to connect to this cluster proxy. So, but it's quite difficult to use. So in our real use cases, we actually will have to build some HTTP proxies in front of the cluster proxy. So that's also something that multi-cluster gateway does. And in the cluster ADM, we also does a similar thing that we will when we run cluster ADM proxy, we will start a temporary HTTP server and then proxy the request to the cluster proxy connectivity interface. But it's not convenient. And another thing is we leverage AMP server to transport TCP over gRPC tunnel. Um, so it's a little bit hard for us to customize. Uh, for example, we might want to add some request headers in the request so we can easily to monitor or audit or tracing the request. We cannot do it with AMP unless we have some external component that proxy the request. And the AMP is running at the black box. There are some configurations that has been hard coded in the AMP, so we cannot change it, such as the keep live time, etc. So it's a little bit hard to do that. Um, and because of the usage of the cluster proxying is uh, larger, but the user still need to, like when they start the OCM control plan, they still need to start the cluster proxy, install the cluster proxies from Helm chart and enable it on the cluster to do that. So it's just add another more steps if user want to use that. And for example, when we run using the multi-queues in the OCM, which means that the user must enable the cluster proxy at first, starting the control plane, enable a cluster proxy, and then install the multi-queue. That's a little bit complicated in terms of the installation step. So that's the main reason that we want to actually, instead of running it independently as an add-on, I'm thinking we could move the core features of class proxy into the core part. So when we starting the OCM, we will just have this feature already. So user doesn't need to enable that add-on anymore. Um, Underlying reason is still that has been widely used and has been used in many integrations. So it seems to make sense to enable it all the time rather than make it as an add-on. So the goal here is that we add a feature flag in the cluster add a feature flag a cluster proxy in class lead and cluster manager. So when the feature gate is enabled, on the hub side, we will start a gRPC server. And on the cluster agent side, the cluster agent will have the gRPC config set up automatically and then connect to the gRPC server. And also when this feature is enabled, the cluster manager will have a HTTP server endpoint instead of the connectivity endpoint. Uh, then we'll start a HTTP server endpoint, and then the user is able to directly use kubectl or REST client to connect to any managed cluster. The other existing features of the cluster proxy will be maintained but move into the core part. Some non-go, but I will discuss it later, is how we want to deprecate and replace. I think we will have some time that both things will be enabled. By default, the feature gate of cluster proxy will be disabled in
Hello? Is my internet issue or QJang stop talking?
exists for a
Oh.
certain time of period. Sorry.
No, no, it's okay. Please continue.
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah. And after, so these two will coexist for a certain time period until all the consumers has been migrated from the cluster proxy add-on to the new one, and then we will discuss how we will deprecate and remove cluster proxy add-on. Um, so this user story is quite simple. Like the user, if the user want to use this feature, the user need to enable the feature gate on the cluster manager and cluster lead, and then the connection will be automatically enabled, and there will be a HTTP request server, HTTP endpoint exposed on the hub side, and the user should be able to connect to that to access the managed clusters. The other is about the authentication part and the impersonation part, and that has been implemented in the cluster proxy, and that part will be kept. There is some design details like we need to consider the registration because by default we are using the hubkube config to connect to the to the hub cluster, the cluster agent using the hubkube config to connect to the managed cluster. So when we enable this feature, the registration part will also need to provide a gRPC config to the proxy component. It will be running in a single binary, but it just need another config, the gRPC config. So it will do is similar as for the add-on, but it's in the registration. We will create another CSR for the gRPC server, and then save the gRPC config to the same hubkube config secret with a different key, and then the endpoint the cluster agent will be able to connect using this gRPC config. So in the hub side, we will provide a HTTP server in the core that with a server address, server port, and the cluster name. So when the user want to access a managed cluster, they can set the endpoint in the kube config in this format, and they certainly they also need the tokens retrieved from the managed service account token or using the token on the hub if impersonation is enabled, and then they can use this one to access a managed cluster. And there is another part about the integration with class profile. So with this part done, we should be able to build a binary that provide the credentials based on the new address, the new HTTP endpoint address in the class of proxy and tokens based on impersonations or managed service account. And which means that we will have a controller on the hub side that will update the status of that part to update the proxy endpoint, etc. So installation part, I can show you what I will have. The thing is that we will have a gRPC configurations field. We already have that for the gRPC based registration, but there's something else we will add it, which is there is a feature gate in it, and when cluster proxy enabled, we need to set it as cluster proxy enabled, and then we need to set a setup endpoint that being exposed externally on the hub side. One is a HTTP endpoint for user to access. Another is a gRPC endpoint that is for agent to access. Um, and so to So what happens if we support the gRPC registration type and also the cluster proxy server? So this is an example in the cluster manager. So you can, in the registration configurations, you can set the registration drivers to both CSR and gRPC, but at the same time also need to set up the gRPC configurations similar as here. So to know that, we don't need to add another gRPC endpoint. The gRPC registration and the cluster proxy will share the same gRPC server. And if the proxy is disabled and we have the gRPC registration enabled, it's simple just to create this one and then set up the gRPC endpoint in here. So that's the main three possible examples that we start in the gRPC class. We start the gRPC server for either class of proxy or registration or both. And on the classless side, we will need to add a gRPC endpoint exposure, and then in this one, we will add something like what's the endpoint of the gRPC for the proxy, what's the CA bundles. So with that, we can, and then the registration part will provide the client cert and client key. So these things will generate the gRPC config for the agent to connect back. So there's something like for the alpha part, I think we will just ensure that the proxy can be installed. It can work with cluster agent or red, and it can collaborate correctly with gRPC registration driver. And then we will move to beta if there's more consumers starting to use that, if we have class ADM update that, adopt that, if we have cluster profile API integrate, etc. And then we consider to the graduate, which means that all the things has been replaced to the new endpoint, and we will discuss about the cluster how we will deprecate the cluster proxy add-on. So I think one of the things that maybe need to consider in the alpha stage is about the scalability, not scalability, but how much request will be sent, how much bandwidth will be consumed by the cluster proxy. So since the gRPC registration part and proxy is using the same gRPC endpoint, It's not clear whether the proxy will impact the G registration request in the gRPC, in the same gRPC endpoint. So this will be need to investigate it. But the the thing is the gRPC server can be horizontally scaled, and possibly in the future we also can, if for the scalability issue, we also can consider like starting two separate gRPC server, one for registration and one for the cluster proxy. Um, so that's something that we can do to alleviate the drawbacks. And for the alternatives, we can enhance the cluster proxy. For example, we can provide the HTTP servers in the cluster proxy add-on, so it still can provide the HTTP endpoint. But my think is, since it has been adopted widely and used in many cases, I think move it into the core makes sense, and it will reduce the effort for the user to use OCN. Um, yes, I think that's all. I think that might be a big change. For example, that might be impact some other component, but um, I will share it to the Slack channel and check whether it makes sense to the other adopters that has already using cluster proxy. Yeah, that's all. Any comments, questions?
And this is great. Thank you, Qzhang, for sharing. And this really, I completely agree that we should have this as a core functionality because this kind of give us the as a core give us the push side as well, where we always say, oh, OCM is pull only, but if you do this add-on, you can do push. But now, essentially, now with this in the core, we have the bi-directional, right? So that's great. And regarding just a small detail in the clusterlet, you know how you have the CA bundle. I'm
Yeah.
wondering if it needs to be defined there as as like a string or whatever value. If it's possible to be like a secret instead, because I like the clusterlet right now. It's kind of I assume the CA bundle is going to be a huge string, right? And
Yeah.
I like the current form of cluster. It's nice and clean and easy to understand instead of having this giant CA bundle in here. That's that's about it.
Okay.
And I guess another comment is from the public interface
Yeah.
perspective. I'm seeing everything as proxy or endpoint or something like that. But I don't see anything like cluster proxy specifically, right? Because I'm worried there's a little confusion. You know what I mean? Like what you the cluster proxy that the core cluster proxy, or are we talking about the cluster proxy with the add-on, right? So that's
Okay.
another thing that I was thinking of because I've done something similar. I forgot which it was. It was like, and the duplicated naming was a little bit confusing to manage. But I don't think you guys have much here that is like cluster proxy, so I think you're good to go as well. No, this is great, and I love
Yeah.
the integration with the cluster inventory API, the cluster profile, so that we're also following the community standard as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Regarding to the naming part, so I have discussion with Xue Zhao on some naming, like he think proxy might be already quite confused. So there are some kind of different naming. So that's
Okay.
also something that we can discuss in the peer.
Great, great. Okay, that's all for me. Does anyone else have any question for Qicheng regarding the moving the cluster proxy into core? Qicheng, do you have any final comments? I think you mentioned you'll post it in the Slack community, but do you have any other thing that you want to mention while we're recording this video?
Um, yeah, I think maybe no. I just so I think the only thing that might be that's still uncertain to me is that because the cluster proxy provide the connectivity interface, and in this proposal, we replace it with HTTP client, HTTP endpoint. I think that's need to be clarified or need to be confirmed with consumers whether it is okay, or how do they feel about we just replace, or they want to still maintain the connectivity part. So that's a main thing that I want to put in the Slack. And for example, I think Tamil is using that in their in their project. So maybe Kuvela is also using that. So I want to confirm with them on this.
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So regarding the overall community, we've done our kind of like a CNCF technical assessment, and then we also done our latest governance changes. So if anyone's interested in that and see what our latest update is, please head over to the community repo. And then regarding the incubation process, I think we're still modifying the final draft of the application itself. And with Qzhang and Shuzhao done an amazing job on the governance as well as the technical review. Um, the final draft of that application shouldn't be too much of an issue. And yeah, in August, we'll make some edits on it tomorrow. And then we'll wait for another review from our CNCF corresponding. And then finally, we should be able to create the issue, which is officially submitting OCM into incubation, hopefully as soon as next week. So, again, thank you all for this ongoing process, and hopefully, we have some good news. So, that's all for me today. Does anyone have anything else regarding the OCM community? Okay. Thank you all for attending and see you all next time. Take care, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
All right.